Imagine that we were in London during the Blitz and we had those debates about whether the government should impose a blackout so that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb us. We would all understand that it was consistent with our liberty to impose those constraints. So everything is a matter of context. Now, I think suspending Boris Johnson from the House of Commons for 90 days, I happen to think that's a great idea. I might make it longer. But it's not, it's a disastrous idea that it should be their decision because they're politicians. It's hard to imagine an institution more ripe to be abused when people, without any respect for the traditions and the conventions within which those systems operate, whenever they come along. You could have a jury, a body of randomly selected citizens who are there, who are paid to turn up every week and to look at what's going on, and the government can't do things that it objects to.
Hello, welcome to another edition of Policy Provocations. I'm Gene Tunney and I'm joined again by Nicholas Groen. Nicholas, good to be with you again.
G'day, Gene. Here am I. There's my trusty green glass of green tea.
Excellent, Nicholas. So in this edition of Policy Provocations, we're going to be talking about liberty. And Nicholas, you wrote a post during the pandemic, didn't you, on your thoughts on liberty and because there was a whole debate about lockdowns and masks, and you had a rather interesting perspective on it. So would you be able to just take us through that, please? Then we might talk about what it all means for policy.
Yeah, so during the COVID period, everybody got themselves very worked up about compulsions, impositions by government, and they were lockdowns, vaccine mandates, mask mandates. And it's entirely appropriate that people talk about those things and debate those things and have different views about those things and also have passionately different views about those things. That's just fine and dandy. But imagine that we were in London during the Blitz and we had those debates about whether the government should impose a blackout so that the Luftwaffe couldn't bomb us. We would all understand that it was consistent with our liberty to impose those constraints. And likewise, if there is absolute chaos, that it is consistent with restoring liberty and actually to getting some liberty to impose martial law, for instance. So everything is a matter of context. Now, is that me not caring about these issues, about people's liberties under these particular measures? Well, as I wrote in the blog post, I'm the only person I know who's got a record going back 40 years of actually taking this subject seriously, but I took it seriously in a rather different way. I didn't say, I'm always going to be sort of leaning towards liberty rather than coercion. What I said was, what are the things about our Constitution that would be the first things that an authoritarian trying to take control of government or deny basic democratic values, what are the first things, where would they head? What are the weaknesses in our Constitution that would help them out? And so when John Button, who I worked for, Senator John Button in 1981, he was in opposition, and I wrote out, with the help of the Clerk of the Senate, Harry Evans, I wrote out a private member's bill on the subject of parliamentary privilege. Because at the time then, and it is still the case now, the members of either house, either our House of Representatives or our Senate, can meet as a privileges committee and they can decide, according to whatever procedures they wish to adopt, to put someone in jail for parliamentary privilege, contempt of Parliament, including one of their own members, as two journalists were put in jail in Australia in the 1950s. And so this private members bill actually picked up some old work of, from memory, Owen Dixon, who became the Chief Justice, but I think this was when he was Attorney General, if he was Attorney General. I think he was. And it started with a private members bill he wrote, and we went over it and made it to our own satisfaction. And so all that Parliament could do was to hold initial hearings and then to present the case to a magistrate, to an independent magistrate, saying this person is guilty of contempt of Parliament and over to you. Now, that is a much safer way to deal with this matter and a way that is consistent with our liberties taken seriously. And it's quite a topical thing because, as you may recall, the House of Commons Privileges Committee has just met and considered the routinely egregious behaviour of its former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and decided that he would be suspended for 90 days. Now, I think suspending Boris Johnson from the House of Commons for 90 days, I happen to think that's a great idea. I might make it longer. But it's a disastrous idea that it should be their decision because they're politicians. And it's very easy to imagine a situation where in fact, it's hard to imagine an institution more ripe to be abused when people, without any respect for the traditions and the conventions within which those systems operate, whenever they come along. So that's an introduction to this idea of liberty as being fundamentally about the legitimacy of government and then secondarily about these particular decisions that get made.
Right. Just before we go on, Nicholas, which jurisdiction were those? Did you say 2 journalists were jailed by
Commonwealth, 1956 thereabouts, maybe 1954. The House of Representatives took umbrage at these journalists. You can look it up. I can't remember the exact details, but the journalist reported a private discussion or something. It was just the sort of thing that's pretty standard practice now. Off they went, cooled their heels in Goulburn jail for a week or so, and they could be detained indefinitely. There's nothing in our Constitution or in the rules of the House of Representatives that prevents the House of Representatives from locking up anyone for any length of time in jail. Now, we now have a more activist High Court that would probably get itself involved and say this is not consistent with the spirit of the Australian Constitution, but that's what happened. And nobody... Yeah. And then what happened is Button released this thing to the public, it was a bit of a disaster because he hadn't read it very carefully. And I tried to take him through it, but he was kind of busy or tired or something. And Michelle Grattan started asking him quite detailed questions about the bill, and he didn't know what was in it, which was a little embarrassing. Then his party turned on him and people walked past him in the corridors saying, "What has got into you? Why would you want to do this?" And he wasn't too sure himself. It was really all my idea. And it, another idea of mine, no one knows who had it,
Yeah. So I just want to understand what you're arguing. You're arguing that, well, okay, so liberty, yeah, you're taking it seriously. You're interested in the constitutional framework or all the rules we have in place that can affect liberty before we get into one of these situations like the pandemic. And I'm just trying to understand what you're arguing. You want to make sure that we've got the right mechanisms or the right infrastructure in place so that we make the right decisions, or what are you arguing exactly?
Well, I'm arguing that if you're serious about liberty, you accept that sometimes governments, you accept a few things. You accept that governments need, in the final analysis, to have quite draconian powers if we're at war and so on. So that puts the focus on safeguards, and it also puts the focus on the importance of legitimacy. So in the post that I did during COVID, I said I would have thought that it would be a good idea during COVID, if you want to introduce these emergency measures, and we talk about this a lot now. It's one of the things I go on about, which is you could have a jury, a body of randomly selected citizens who are there, who are paid to turn up every week and to look at what's going on, and the government can't do things that it objects to. I think that would have protected a lot of governments and would have protected us from a lot of the culture war that we saw, because these kinds of things need to reflect they need to reflect a sense of legitimacy, and they need to reflect the confidence of people that they're doing what they think is the right things and for the right reasons. And there was a great, the activism against mask mandates, for instance, was because I regard mask mandates as the least intrusive and the most evidence-based, or the least intrusive kind of intervention you could have. And I think it would be good if we had mask mandates on public transport properly enforced even now. And again, that's a virus is a public good, is an externality. These are difficult questions, and so you want to find a way to navigate them with proper community involvement, and that's not really what we. If we simply have governments and the usual sort of activism against those governments, it becomes very easy to turn it into a kind of standard issue culture war, which is what we saw more in the United States than here, but certainly it's become that way here to a substantial extent.
Yeah. Okay. So there are a few things I want to comment on there.
Yep.
So you're right about government. I mean, it needs the ability to at times do things that, do constrain liberties. There's no doubt about that. Government has a monopoly on violence, as they say.
Yep.
I agree with you there. Now, this point about getting the citizens involved, the citizens' jury. Look, perhaps I think it would have been good to have done it before we got into the pandemic. Because the problem is, because of all of the fear, then the citizens' jury might end up just supporting a lot of these policies. Well, I mean, I mean, the concern I would have is that a lot of these policies were driven by fear, and which to an extent, I mean, to some extent, was rational. For some people, for sure. I mean, it was certainly a serious virus. But the governments, they would argue that they were polling people, like Dan Andrews and Anastasia Palaszczuk, they were relying on opinion polling, and that was driving a lot of their policy making. So they would argue they had that legitimacy.
So I make a distinction, as I think you might know, between the opinion of the people for which I don't have a high regard and the considered opinion of the people for which I do have a high regard. So, and certainly the considered opinion of the people, I think the considered opinion of the people would have looked very like the opinion of the people early on. But if it was really fairly clear that a lot of this was the product of Project Fear, then there would be people in a citizen jury that would, the citizen jury would have powers to ask questions, to call witnesses, all that kind of stuff. And that's we spoke about this in the previous podcast we did on a different subject. The structure we have is a government that is constantly performing, is a government that is constantly performing for the satisfaction of its consumers, i.e. the voters. This is what corporations do, and what we need to do, and what we need to do is to find mechanisms for bringing ordinary people, these people who we accept are the legitimate source of democratic government, to bring them into the process and to inform them as best we can, and then ask them to deliberate, and then give the considered opinion of the people an important role in this. And it isn't just that I think it would lead to better decisions. It would lead to it does lead, when you see it being done, to a tremendously less hostile, fearful environment. The situation we were in, we had to make decisions. I don't even want to defend lockdowns. I don't want to attack them either. They were difficult decisions. You could see that I could see, and you might have seen something different, and we'll never know who's right. But I think I could see politicians doing their best, and that's a very important thing to cultivate during a crisis. And this sort of mechanism does that.
Yeah, look, I'm not going to criticise them for. I mean, I think they took it seriously. I think they were trying to do their best. I agree there. I just think there's a good case to be made that there was an overreaction. And it was because of the amount of fear, and they were making policy based on the fear at the time. Now, pre-pandemic, didn't we have all of these plans for what we would do during the pandemic, and it didn't involve half of the things that's right that we ended up doing. When we were looking at it rationally, and we had a different idea of what we could do, but then because of maybe there aren't enough checks and balances or constraints, there's not enough there wasn't enough time to actually properly consider these policies. Like what we had in Queensland here, we had the government. It had a Public Health Act that it introduced in 2005, and it was thinking, we may need something like this in case there is an emergency, a pandemic. But then when we get to the actual pandemic, they're starting to worry about it all, and they're thinking, oh my God, we actually may not have all the powers we need to deal with this, and so they rush through this bill to give Jeanette Young, the Chief Health Officer at the time, all of these extra powers so she can direct individual citizens to isolate and impose lockdowns, etc. And I mean, one of the problems we've got here in Queensland, and this is why I am attracted to your idea of looking at the institutions, the whatever you want to call it, the policy architecture. I like that as a concept because one of the problems we've got here in Queensland is we don't have an upper house, which would provide some friction. Maybe it's not enough because other states have upper houses, and that didn't stop.
It wouldn't do a lot.
These policies, right. And one thing I found is that there just wasn't enough. Our mechanisms weren't working. There wasn't enough scrutiny. I mean, I spoke at a parliamentary committee here in Queensland in early 2021, and I was trying to make the case that I thought that some of the restrictions were excessive and we should look at this in a cost-benefit framework. But the only politician who actually was sympathetic was the One Nation MP, that both Labor and the coalition, or the LNP up here, they were sort of, not wanting to question anything. There was sort of a consensus view. And I mean, I don't mind if they come to that legitimately, but I just thought there should have been more questioning in the parliament. But everyone just sort of said, we're just going to, the normal mechanisms or what we would hope would occur in a democracy just didn't work. There wasn't enough contestability, or there wasn't enough considered development of policy.
Well, I completely agree with you, but I think I don't have a lot of hope that will arise. I don't think it's particularly easy to bring that about now, because if you look at the life of a politician, certainly a politician in a major party, they're like the major parties are kind of like battleships, manoeuvring around, getting a position on a thing, circulating their talking points, and then enforcing rigid party discipline. And when an important issue comes along that people are very emotional about, the press is doing the same thing. The press is trying to maximize clicks, report excitement. If you get up in the House and you make a speech which isn't entirely in support of your own party and call for, and you discuss the issues, well, you're not going to get any benefits in your own party for that. The press will go through it and pick out bits of what you've just said to amp them up, and then they'll stick a microphone in front of the party leader's face and say, well, do you agree with what your backbencher said about what's going on in Logan? This is just a disastrous environment in which to get high-level discussion. And that's, again, why I'm arguing that actually people still like discussion, not on our airwaves, but in the right forums. You bring them together and they speak to each other civilly, and they try to see each other's point of view, and they try to compromise and explore their way to a common view. Now, that's almost totally absent from our politics. I think it's terrific that the Teals have done as well as they have in federal parliament, because it has set the clock back a bit. I know we're supposed to think of setting the clock back as a bad thing, but the way the Teals do electoral politics is a bit more like the way I was saying this to a Teal the other day, one of the members of parliament. It's a bit more like backbenchers were 35 years ago. They can talk about their own situation, their own concerns. They're not completely preoccupied with the talking points of their party and so on. But if we want really proper deliberation, we better try and think about how we, I was going to say route around Parliament. Well, Parliament has the power, but it's not going to, the way our society runs at the moment, there's nothing much you can do to make that discussion a search for the truth. It's a search for advantage. And so we have to try to think, how do we build institutions that cover for that allow discussion to take place, allow these processes to take place without imagining that that's going to happen in Parliament. I do. Yeah, sorry, you want to say something?
I was just going to ask. I mean, like you mentioned the Teals, and they've really shaken things up. That's for sure. Do we need more, more representation from different groups? Could proportional representation help with that?
It might be able to help with that. I think it may have helped in something a bit like proportional representation in New Zealand. I think the most toxic politics I know of is in our two historical great and powerful friends, Great Britain and the United States. Both have first past the post voting. I was going to say both have two major parties. Well, that is true in the United Kingdom, but they also have an outrider, the Liberal Democrats. But that's become a very toxic. Those provided very toxic political environments, and the extent to which we've injected other elements, I think, has been good. And in fact, you will recall what I call the randos in the Senate, people like Ricky Muir, who got into the Senate, and you could imagine it almost like a randomizing process. You just throw 4 or 5 random people in who happen to get the benefit of tiny little preference margins. Well, I thought that was actually a very good illustration of it. It didn't make much sense on paper, but the people who ended up in the Senate listened to the debate and tried to come up with the right answer. Now, that would never do inside a political party. You're not in Parliament to try and work out who's winning the debate and where the answers are. You're there to add one vote to your party, and that's all decided by the party structures. They're completely disastrous.
Yeah, I think the Senate does, its structure and the way that, because it's got more it's not just one, it's dominated by one party, that leads to arguably better outcomes. And I think the Housing Australia Future Fund, I think that getting held up, I think that was a good idea because that doesn't seem to make much sense as a policy. I know the Greens are getting bashed over the head over that, but I think their stance was perfectly acceptable.
I don't think you'd be as keen on their proposal for rent control.
No, I'm not keen on their proposal, but I think them actually teaming up in the so-called axis of evil with the coalition was very good. So
exactly.
The reasons they opposed it was sensible. I don't agree with what they're proposing instead. But I was just saying that's a good illustration of the Senate federally working.
Yes, I agree.
And I think, I like the way you're thinking about this. We've got to get the right frameworks in place. And so when we get into the crisis, we're not just, we've got a proper way to deal with it. What I was wondering is whether we decide before a crisis, so outside of a pandemic, these are the thresholds. If we exceed this threshold, if this virus looks like it's of this seriousness, we're willing to accept these restrictions. Like we decide all of that prior to the pandemic. So when we get into it, we don't have we're not panicking and we're not imposing restrictions that arguably aren't justifiable. So I'm wondering if we should work all of that out and then sort of have the debate there, and you could have your citizens' jury, you could have a more considered process rather than it just being decided all in a panic during the pandemic.
Yeah, well, I think you can, there's a case for trying to show what foresight you can, but remember, all of our plans were predicated, this is an extraordinary thing, that all of our plans were predicated on the idea that this pandemic would be a flu. It wasn't a flu. And yet all of our entire official medical establishment, that is the people like Brendan Murphy, Paul Kelly, these are the official Commonwealth medical officers and state medical officers, they didn't bat an eyelid. They didn't say, right, we need to rethink this. That happened actually the first medical establishment, and by medical establishment, I don't mean doctors, I mean in general, I mean the officers of the government that are there to provide the government with medical advice. The first country that did this was the New Zealand medical establishment, and they did a pretty good job. After a couple of months, they said, hang on, this is not a flu, we need to rethink this, and that's what they did. That we were incredibly inflexible, not adaptive, and a lot of these guys were thinking of their role as making rules for the community rather than helping the community think through the problems. So I would put more effort into that, but we're still drifting into this question of how do you manage a crisis. And what I'm saying is that crises will be well or badly managed, and that it's an important thing to think about. But every time, I suppose you are doing something which I'm kind of arguing we should do, which is that every time this sort of thing happens, we should be asking ourselves questions on two levels. What do we do now? And what sorts of institutions should we have to do this thing well? And there we probably should wrap up because we've gone on for a fair while. But one of the things that just gobsmacks me is in the United States, 51 people, all the governors and the president, have a pardon power. Now, maybe some of the states have done to the pardon power what I wanted to do to parliamentary privilege and to contempt of Parliament. But by and large, the president simply decides, as Boris Johnson decided regarding various knighthoods and so on, that it's simply an exercise of executive power to give someone a pardon. And so much so that there is serious discussion about whether Donald Trump can pardon himself in jail, because there's certainly a precedent for him campaigning in jail. That was done in World War I when Mr. Dobbs was in jail and picked up something like 3% of the vote from jail. He was in jail for breach of the Espionage Act, the same act that Julian Assange is arraigned under or being pursued under. Now, I don't know, I am unaware of a single Democratic politician who says, by the way, we've got to get rid of the presidential pardon power, or if you don't want to get rid of it, we have to subject it to proper due process. We are no longer in the 18th century. And nobody does this. And I find that completely extraordinary. So there you are. I won't say another word about it in protest.
Okay. Well, Nicholas, thanks again for a fantastic policy provocation. That one was particularly provoking. Gave me a lot to think about, and reflecting on that period we've been through, and lots to think about for policy. So thanks again. Really enjoyed that one.
Thanks, Jen.